Good morning, students. Welcome to week 3 of the class. Really enjoyed discussions this week on the boards about teaching as a profession. I had a few thoughts there based on some things that came out in the conversations that are interesting. The most common thing that people said was, this question was an interesting one. Is teaching a profession? And sort of the response seemed to be, well, yeah, like what else would you call it? And honestly, like what else would you call it is a fairly troubling question. What I was asking you to think about, or what I'd like you to think about more, is this phenomenon that we call the deprofessionalization of teaching. Um, Most of you responded in some way like, of course, teaching is a profession. Why else would I be bothering? Or what else would you call it? And the justification a lot of you gave was, well, it requires specific training and and you get paid for it. So it's a profession. Well, there are all sorts of things that I don't think carry the same status as a professional that require training and you get paid for it. Waiting tables, for instance, or bartending. You can take a class to become a bartender. You pay money to take a class to become a bartender, and then you get paid to do it. But I don't think anybody would call a bartender a professional in the way that you call like a doctor or a lawyer a professional. You're asked to act professionally by your manager, but ultimately you are just an employee, right? You make a lot of money if you do it well, but you're still just an employee. And what I'd like you to think about then is the most troubling question is, if teaching is a profession, then why doesn't it carry the professional status that other professions do? Thinking particularly doctors and lawyers. And the main difference between the two is pay, right? People call teaching the noble profession, even though which is a nice way of saying it's hard work, but we're not going to pay you anything. Why don't teachers get paid that much? I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Why don't they get paid that much? Because they should. I don't think there's anyone who could make a decent argument at this point that teachers shouldn't get paid more, except to say that, well, teachers might not be good at their jobs. And here's what I'd like you to think about. Doctors and lawyers might not be good at their jobs, but the amount of training and time they put into becoming doctors and lawyers guarantees them the benefit that they're going to be assumed to know what they're doing until proven otherwise. And the current status with high stakes testing, accountability movements and things like that, the constant assumption for teachers is that they don't know what they're doing unless they can prove otherwise. Teachers are always in the act of proving that they know what they're doing, rather than it being assumed that they do because you've gone to school, because you've been through your training, because you've sat through your practicums and things like that. And so I think we need to continue to think about and explore in this course, well, what is it about teaching that doesn't garner it the respect, that doesn't garner it the sort of professional clout that other professions like doctors, lawyers, business folks do? Like, why not? And then there's this credentialing aspect to it as well that teachers have to face. A lot of you said, and I think it's really great in your responses, that teaching requires more than just your training. Like, there's something unique about being a teacher, a quality that you have to have. But I do want you to think about how important that credential is. And I think a useful example is the movie The King's Speech, if you've never seen it. Jeffrey Rush is teaching Colin Firth how to get rid of his stutter in this movie, The King's Speech. He's the king. His brother abdicated. Now he's taken the throne, but he has this terrible stutter. And Jeffrey Rush is a speech coach that has to get him out of it. But there's a point in the movie, spoiler alert, I guess. There's a point in the movie in which the king realizes that Jeffrey Rush didn't go to school for speech therapy. He has no degree in it. He just found out that he came back from World War I and found he had a particular skill with his theater training and getting soldiers who had what they called shell shock sort of rehabilitated in speech patterns, and he was good at it. However, the king in the movie was put off. He said, "How dare you? You've deceived me, because I thought you were a legitimate authority on this subject. And so what the interesting thing about that example is he was an exceptional teacher and he was an expert in the field. He just didn't go to school to make himself that way. So what I'd like you to think about in terms of becoming a teacher, but also then that the rigors we put students through, is that relationship between experiential knowledge and the credentialing process. Which is more important? And I don't just mean sort of theoretically which is more important, but which one is going to get you a job, right? Which one is going to carry the status of authority out into the workforce for you and for your students and whatever they want to do? A degree or 20 years experience? And the answer is not always the same because depending on what job you're applying for, right? So we're going to move later in this course into this idea of the relationship between work and school. And those are some things I'd like you to think about. Yeah. All right. So for this week, I've asked you to think about the role of the teacher. And I would like some of what I'm talking about here to show up possibly in the discussion posts. Because our reading got canceled. I thought I had a PDF of it. I apologize that for whatever reason I don't. And so Bill Ayers to teach. Bill's a lifetime educator. He wrote To Teach about 15 years ago, and then he recreated it with an artist as a graphic novel. I encourage you to seek it out on Amazon. You can get it on Kindle for like $8. For the purpose of this course, it's no longer required, but find it, read it. It's enlightening. I want you to think about what you think the role of the teacher is. And just like last week's question, is teaching a profession, this one seems relatively self-evident. The role of the teacher is to teach, right? What other thing could it be? But really, it's almost a trick question. The answer to this question is going to be, it depends on who you ask. The role of the teacher, yes, you must teach, but there's so many other things the teacher has to do. If you're going to ask an administrator, the role of the teacher is to get kids to pass tests. Right? You are in the room to make sure that the school does not reflect poorly in standardized exams. That is what an administrator is going to ask you to do. And it is ultimately what a politician is going to ask you to do. We have a presidential election coming up. Please pay attention to the rhetoric around teaching, schools, and education in these campaign speeches. It is one of the most successful rallying cries a political candidate could have, to stand on the podium and say, I'm going to get rid of all the bad teachers. I'm going to fire all the bad teachers. And everybody cheers and shoots their 6-shooters into the air, and it's a real hootenanny. I want you to think about what you think that means. What does a politician mean when he says, let's get rid of bad teachers? Because I think if you were to take the time to make a column, I do this when we teach this on campus, take a piece of paper, put a column down the middle, and write all the qualities for good teacher and all the qualities for bad teacher you can think of. I'm willing to bet that every single person in this course is going to have these emotive responses. A good teacher knows how to inspire, knows how to have emotional connections with kids, knows how to convey material in a way that's interesting. A lot of you in your autobiographies wrote this idea. The best teachers I had were the ones that connected with me on a personal level and were excited about their material. However, when someone running for president says get rid of bad teachers, what they mean is I'm going to fire anybody who cannot get kids to pass tests at our prescribed level. That is an entirely different interpretation of good and bad teacher. So part of the discussion this week says, what is a good teacher? What is a bad teacher? I want you to think about who's asking that question, because the answer's not the same for everybody. I think a bad teacher is one that is racist or homophobic or sexist or emotionally damages a child. I think a teacher is one that falls asleep on their desk while they play videos. Those are bad teachers. A teacher that is under-resourced and can't possibly get a math class to perform at a state-determined level because they have been set up to fail, that is not a bad teacher. That's a teacher with trying to juggle with both hands tied behind their back. So I want you to think about what you want the teacher to give, and I'll give you sort of 3 possible definitions, and you can do what you want with them. The first is a bureaucratic administrator, and this is sort of the teacher I just described that your administration wants. You are there to proctor exams, to teach kids how to do school, how to take tests, how to pass tests. My kids come home with math homework, and I help them with the concepts, but inevitably they're going to come home with a sheet that says test prep, and they are learning how to take the math exam at the end of the semester. Not learning how to do math, they're learning how to pass a math test. I'm hoping by my tone you can tell I don't care for this version of teacher, but it is an expectation of you in the classroom, and you're going to have to figure out how to navigate it. There's another example. A philosopher named Nell Noddings has a whole school of thought that she calls care theory. And essentially she says a teacher must be a carer. You must care for students. And that doesn't just mean, that tends to get sort of plopped onto the lap of like our kindergarten teachers. That is where you have this really touchy-feely apple sweater sitting on a carpet coloring and eating glue relationship with your students. It's true of all teachers. You must care. The first role of all teachers is to care for the people in your room. And if you're teaching something really antiseptic like math or science, something that seems sort of detached from emotion, you still have to care about the bodies that exist in your space. And Nell Noddings makes the argument that it's absolutely impossible to make an intellectual connection unless that emotional connection comes first. I think Horton and Ferrari would agree. I think John Dewey would agree. And I encourage you to look up Nell Noddings' work. It's not assigned for this course, but her ideas of care theory and teacher as caregiver are important ones. And then Ferrari himself makes the argument in a different work that the teacher has to be what he calls the change agent, which means you must look out into your world, you must see the things you want to be different, and your goal is to motivate students to be that change, right? You're not teaching students, you're teaching adults. You're not teaching students, you're teaching future citizens. What kind of world do you want them to make? What kind of opportunities do you want them to give to be able to make that world? That's another really interesting and important one to think about. How do you want to engage students so they're ready to go out into the world and do as opposed to float? There's all these other interesting models people make for teachers. Teacher is the social worker. Teacher is the parent. There's a phrase in Latin, in loco parentis, which doesn't mean crazy parents. It means in place of the parents. And that's one of the longest standing ideas about what the teacher is. You are there in place of the parents. You are an adult that these kids see more than their parents a lot of the time. Monday through Friday, August to May, the kids will see you, your students will see you, especially if you're their only teacher, your students will see you more than they see their parents sometimes. And that is not a dig at the parents. That is a reality of the school day. You get home, you have enough time to eat and go to bed. You get your parents for 2 hours that day. You had the teacher for 7. And so with that comes then the responsibility. How do you want to spend that time? What do you think the actual role of the teacher is? And again, the answer is going to be different depending on who you ask. An administrator wants you to play a different role than you perhaps want, that the parent perhaps wants you to fill, that your colleagues want you to fill. You're going to have to decide for yourself what you want your own role to be, and more importantly, you're going to have to figure out how to navigate all of those different expectations. Even if you want to be the caregiver and the change agent, you still have to be the bureaucratic administrator. You have to get kids to pass tests. It's the reality of where we are right now in schools. And I think that's going to go away. I don't want to be too doom and gloom about it. I think the idea that all it is test prep, that's going to go away eventually. We're going to realize as we're starting to, the numbers are rolling in, it's not working. And we'll do something different. Dewey's Way will come back around. It does about every 30 years. And we're due for a renewal. About every 30 years, somebody dusts off John Dewey, and like it's newly discovered that it's never existed before. We'll get there again. But for now, an expectation is that you're going to get kids to pass tests at a particular level. You have to figure out how to do that while doing some of these other more meaningful things, and just sort of wait it out. Because, and this is, I think, the final thought for what I'm saying here, if you wait for the cycle of test preparation, high stakes test accountability, if you wait for all of that to go away before you have any meaningful connection with students, we are going to lose a decade of children. That's I don't think the tests are going anywhere for maybe 10 more years, but that is the entire education of a child. If a kid hits kindergarten today, and let's say 10 years from now, we get rid of high stakes testing, he's going to be almost out of high school. That's not good enough. We have to do something with that particular student in the next 10 years. That even though we've got all this sort of silly and perfunctory testing going on, we have to do something to connect with that child in the meantime. We can't wait for it to go away first, because we're gonna lose a lot of children, and we have to do better. Okay. So as you think about the role of the teacher, what makes a good teacher and bad teacher, think about that thing I just said, that there are lots of different answers to that question, and it's going to depend on the perspective of who's asking. So think about how that might inform the way you answer those questions for discussion this week. I'll send out an email probably later in the week about expectations for our next paper, which is due next Friday, the court case paper. I'll send out an email with details. I'll send out the rubric if it isn't already posted, so there's no questions there. Otherwise, I look forward to this week's discussion, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.